Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be discussing Zora Neale Hurston, the author of Sweat, the short story that you read for this week. And Zora Neale Hurston is one of a few African American writers who we're going to be reading about for the next week or so. Now, Hurston was born in the early 1900s, and she died in January of 1960. And she was one of the most prolific African American women writers of her time, as well as just a highly regarded artist and intellectual from the Harlem Renaissance. As a bit of background, the Harlem Renaissance was a literary, artistic, and intellectual outpouring by African Americans living in New York City in the 1920s. And the era, which lasted for about a decade or so, produced African American philosophers, artists, scholars, writers, and musicians, many of whom you've probably already heard of, such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, W.B. Du Bois, Louis Armstrong, Josephine Baker, and Zora Neale Hurston. So Hurston is a particularly interesting figure among these various writers because she was a fiction writer and also an anthropologist. All in all, she published 4 novels, the most famous of which is Their Eyes Were Watching God. She also published numerous short stories, 2 books of folklore, and several nonfiction essays. Now, Hurston herself was a Southerner. She was born and raised in Eatonville, Florida, which is an all black town north of Orlando. She left home around the age of 14 and she took a series of odd jobs before enrolling at Howard University, a historically black university in Washington, D.C. There, she majored in English and began writing short stories. In 1925, she moved to New York City, where she quickly became a welcome member of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, and she ended up finishing her degree at Radcliffe College. But during that time that she was at Radcliffe, she switched her major over to anthropology. Her academic work in anthropology as a college student earned her the notice of a prominent anthropologist for whom she began working as an apprentice after graduation. And in this role, she traveled back south to do field work on the culture, language, and folklore of rural African Americans in the Deep South. Now, in her fiction writing, she often explores the experiences of African American characters, in particular women. And her fiction tends to be imbued with African American folklore and marked by a rural black dialect of Central Florida, which is something that you might have noticed in the dialogue in Sweat. Like Lahiri, her writing also explores characters who have experienced things like marital problems, love issues, and also self-discovery. And this makes sense. In one of her last essays, Hurston argued that American readers needed to move beyond their stereotypes of African Americans derived from things like vaudeville acts, advertisements, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, and instead needed to see more realistic and complex depictions of African Americans. And it strikes me that Sweat is a text that just does just that. Now, Sweat is a freestanding short story. It was published in the November 1926 issue of Fire. And as one scholar has pointed out, it's really about the death of a marriage, the marriage between Delia and Sykes. Delia is a strong, religious, hardworking, and independent woman, but she's unappreciated by her husband Sykes. He's repeatedly beaten her since they first got married, and he's also had numerous extramarital affairs. Sykes is currently having an affair with Bertha, and he's trying to force Delia out of her home in order to move Bertha in. He tries repeatedly to scare Delia away from her home by exploiting her phobia about snakes. So he first tries to pass off his whip as a snake. Next, he brings home a rattlesnake in a box. And then when that doesn't work, he appears to have escalated, and the text suggests he let the snake loose in her laundry hamper. But instead of scaring her away, he winds up being attacked and bitten by the snake himself. So as you're reading, I want you to think about how the story portrays the dissolution of Delia and Sykes' marriage, both through dialogue and also through symbolism. And I also want you to think about Delia and Sykes as characters. And one way to think about them is what this text has to say about the gender dynamics of their marriage. Delia's strength seems to threaten Sykes, in particular his sense of masculinity. which leads me to wonder why it is that he ends up beating his wife continuously. Is it possibly to assert a sense of masculinity that he feels is threatened? And then how do you read the end, where Delia fails to warn or rescues her husband? Why do you think she holds back? And what's the significance of this act? I'm interested in talking about these issues with you on the discussion board. I look forward to seeing you there. Please let me know if you have any questions.